At long last, we're taking a look at my personal favorite movies of all time. Now, this has been divided up into two categories. The first category that we're going to be covering today is my favorite movies that I've only seen one time. And I'd say this is the less definitive category. And the second group, which I consider kind of the definitive category, is movies that I've seen at least two times, some of which I've seen probably a dozen times or more over the years. So, when we talk about movies I've only seen once, there's a number of different reasons for it. Probably the first and most common one is that the movie in question is just very intense, very scary, or kind of emotionally disturbing or upsetting. That's not to say it's not a great movie because it's on this list, but it's something I'm not sure if I necessarily want to watch again or sit through again. And there's a couple really good examples of that on this list. Or I think that the impact it will have just won't be the same the second time now that I know about the plot and know about the twists or things like that. And number one on the list, this list is very much a case of that. Second reason I haven't seen some of these more than once is they're just very long. And because they're so long, it's harder for me to sit through a movie a second time that's like 3 hours. I know it's just kind of a mental block considering how many like terrible hour and a half long movies I watch. I could probably, instead of watching two horrible found footage films, rewatch one of the movies on this list. It's just something I never seem to get around to. And the other reason is because some of these movies I watched relatively recently, and it's just kind of too soon for me to go back and rewatch it and kind of get a different perspective on it. So that being said, let's get into the top 11 movies, because I couldn't narrow it down to top 10, that I've seen only once, but I would consider some of my favorites. So we're going to start off with It Follows. Excellent, excellent movie. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend going out. Very basic plot. It features the STD, or the sexually transmitted demon. So what happens is someone is currently cursed with the demon, and the demon will follow after you. It can only move at a very slow pace, but it will go through walls. It will follow you wherever you go. And once it reaches you, it'll kill you. Now, you can't get rid of the demon, although the ending is somewhat ambiguous about that. But what you can do is you can transfer it to someone else by having sex with them. So it's the sexually transmitted demon. And if you kill if it manages to kill the person who currently is cursed, it goes back to the previous person who is cursed. So the idea is you try to have sex to pass it as quickly as possible. Now this film has a lot of things going for it. I'm not sure exactly when this movie's supposed to be set. It kind of has a 1970s, 1960s, 1980s feel. It is kind of set in that time period like Youth and Revolt or some other movies that's kind of timeless. Some of I kind of feel like the Spider-Man movies, the Sam Raimi ones, also kind of take place in that floating, ambiguous timeline that's somewhat before the present, which I think is a good setting for a horror movie to keep that timeless category. Secondly, it's just very well directed. Cinematography's great, writing's great, acting is great. It's not a purely like paint by numbers horror film. Like, you don't have the lame thing where everyone just has to die at the end for the sake of fulfilling tropes. It is a rather, I guess you could say, more complex film. I do like the themes within it. Obviously, there's the concept of original sin being spread through sex, that you're spreading this demonic creature through having premarital sex and that sort of thing, and the people who are obviously abstinent don't have to worry about this demon. I also like the theme about the inevitability of death, that it slowly chases after you, but you can only run from it for so long. And I think they specifically reference this a couple of places by talking about Dostoevsky. But overall, it is one of the most innovative horror films that I'd seen in a long time, and it's still great. The reason I haven't watched it more than once is just it was very intense, and frankly, it really kind of scared me. And for some movies like this, it's kind of hard to just sit down and watch it again because you feel a little uncomfortable. Next film on this list is Gran Torino. If you haven't watched Gran Torino, it's basically a racist version of Up. Clint Eastwood is a war veteran whose wife dies at the start of the movie, and he's exceedingly racist and based. And the neighborhood he lives in, a bunch of Vietnamese move in, and he starts to develop kind of a friendship with one of the kids who's growing up without a father figure. And he kind of becomes a father figure to the kid. He teaches him how to be a man. He teaches him how to uh, do construction work, how to work on cars, how to get girls, all that kind of stuff. And it's just a very touching story, a very good kind of coming of age story. Clint Eastwood's character has a redemption arc. The ending has a very strong Christian theme to it. Just an all round excellent movie. Why it's not higher on the list is simply because I only watched it for the first time relatively recently. And that's the only reason. I don't have it, sorry, not higher on the list, but on the other list. Overall, though, really, really good movie. Highly recommend it. Next, we have Interstellar, the Christopher Nolan film from 2014. Look at this, there's quite a few good movies in 2014. Now, this is the story of, how do you even explain the plot of Interstellar? So, there's a blight on Earth of an unspecified cause that's killing off all of the crops. It is gradually making the atmosphere uninhabitable. And Matthew McConaughey is the last astronaut guy who they can have pilot a spaceship. And they have one Saturn V rocket left to get into space with. And a wormhole to another solar system has opened up in the sky. And they need to fly the Saturn V through the wormhole and try to see if any of the planets within that solar system are ready for colonization. And at the same time, they also need to get data from the black hole in there that will allow them to complete the calculations and invent some sort of anti-gravity thing that will allow all of humanity to escape Earth. So the plot is a bit hokey. I don't really think it's science fiction as much as kind of science fantasy. And you really get into that when you start to get into like the transcendent beings and like the ability of love to cross the ages. It does kind of get fairly far into fantasy territory. And I'm sure there are quite a few flaws with the movie, but I just found Interstellar to be a very intense movie where I was on the edge of my seat the entire time. I had no idea what was going to happen. It was absolutely gorgeous on the big screen. And I just haven't watched it again because I feel like some of the plot problems might stick out more. It's really, really long. And I just don't know if it would be as intense the second time. Next, we have Doctor Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Classic Stanley Kubrick comedy. Really, really solid movie. I need to watch it again at some point. This is one I just never been able to get back to. I've just never gotten around to watching again. There's not a particular reason for this one. If you haven't seen Doctor Strangelove, I highly recommend it. I do think it's one of the best comedies of all time. It involves an insane Air Force general who's trying to trigger a nuclear war by sending his planes out to attack Russia. However, Russia has developed a doomsday device that will kill all life on Earth if a nuclear weapon hits it. There's just a lot of really good deadpan comedy in this. Well, obviously, yeah, there's a lot of deadpan comedy, a lot of parody, a lot of scenes from this movie are very iconic, like the guy with the cowboy hat riding the nuclear bomb. You have such classic lines as "Don't fight in there," You can't fight in here. This is the war room." And I just think it's a good satirizing of the paranoia of the Cold War, of military bureaucracies in general. So, really solid movie. Highly recommend Doctor Strangelove. Next, we have Elite Squad 2: The Enemy Within. I think this is the only. There's one Japanese movie, which I'm sure you can guess what it is, on my favorite movies of all time list. But I think this is the only foreign language film that is on either of my lists. So this is a Brazilian movie. If you haven't seen Elite Squad 1 or 2, I highly recommend it. Elite Squad 1 is more of kind of a hard-boiled action movie. I don't know what I'd really compare it to. Just something really intense with a lot of like death and stuff. The dub for the first one is pretty funny. They didn't really pick very good voice actors to do it. So this is one of the rare cases where I might actually advocate watching the subtitled version. So the first one was really campy and really over the top. This one reminds me a lot more of like a Brazilian version of The Dark Knight. It's a very kind of complicated, interlocking plot. Like the plot, the first movie was all about the main character, who is head of the elite force, which is kind of like their death squads or whatever, the best of the best of the Brazilian police force, and they'd go and kill drug dealers and stuff in the slums. And in this one, they succeed largely. He gets promoted, and he massively expands his squad. And they succeed in largely wiping out a lot of the drug dealers within the slums. However, right-wing politicians form paramilitaries that take over the drug trafficking business. And so you have the guy, and he's now on the inside as part of politics, and the people he's allied with are who kind of put him there are now backstabbing him and are using him to put forward their own corrupt criminal enterprises. So it's just a very good movie in terms of who do you trust, that sort of thing. There's a bunch of like pretentious university professors who talk about how like police brutality is destroying the country, and then people like argue back and that kind of thing. Just a really good action thriller film. Highly recommend Elite Squad 1 and 2. We have Requiem for a Dream next. This one it should be pretty obvious why this movie is on this list. This is one of the best movies ever made in terms of writing, cinematography. It's just really, really disturbing. So Requiem for a Dream tells the story of four, I guess you could, I don't know if they're working class or lower class or what you want to call them, four people from Coney Island and their experiences with drug usage. In, I think, 3 cases, heroin, and in 1 case of the mother, I'm not sure what it is. I think it's like Adderall or something like that. And basically their entire lives just revolve around drugs. Like the main guy keeps stealing his mother's TV and pawning it to get more heroin. His best friend's also kind of a shithead. He has his girlfriend Jennifer Connelly, who's also a heroin addict. And the mother is obsessed with watching game shows all day, every day, and she gets a call about being on a game show, and so she gets a doctor to prescribe her, I don't know, Adderall or methamphetamine or something to try to lose weight to look good for it, and she just goes insane with it and takes too much of it, and by the end of the film, she's just like in a mental hospital receiving electrical shock treatment. It's just they all spiral down into complete and total insanity, and it's very good, but it's very disturbing and difficult to watch. Like just the way they wind out at the end. We have like Jennifer Connelly has like becomes a prostitute to get more drug money and engages in really degenerate shit. And there's like a scene near the end of the movie where after she's had really demeaning sex with another girl, he throws her a bundle of money, and then she hugs it lovingly and falls asleep holding it. One guy loses his arm, another guy winds up in jail. It's just everyone's completely fucked from the drugs. And it's just, like I said, it's a very disturbing and difficult to watch movie, but it's one of the best movies probably ever made. Next, we have another Darren Aronofsky film, Noah. This is a film I really liked. It's a movie a lot of other people didn't like. I'm not sure why that is exactly. I think part of it might be a lot of Christians didn't like it because it changes some stuff in the Bible. And probably a lot of other people didn't like it because it was based on something from the Bible. I think it's a really interesting take on the story of Noah. They put in some kind of like steampunk elements, some more supernatural elements. I find it pretty interesting. So within the context of this, you have the children of Abel, I think it is, gets killed off by the descendants of Cain. And there's this kind of universal monarchy, which is the descendants, from my understanding, of the paternal line of Cain. And at some point in the past, you had a group of angels, the Watchers, who wanted to directly intervene in human life. So they were cast out of heaven. It's kind of cool how the Watchers look in this, because the Watchers were these like big, glowing. I forget if they were humanoids. It's been a while since I've seen the movie, but they were cast down to Earth and they landed in puddles of mud, and the mud it like hardened around them. So they're these deformed shapes that vaguely resemble the traditional concept of what an angel is. And they were kind of these Promethean figures who taught humans all this kind of stuff. There was something of an early industrial revolution where there is this material called Zohar, I think it was called, that allowed early industrialization, but they've run out of it by the time of Noah. And God has more or less decided that with the earth completely destroyed and leveled, all the resources used up, the children of Cain overrunning everything, Noah is the descendant of Seth. And God wants him to, well, destroy the world and rebuild it. And a very strong ongoing theme throughout the movie is Noah doesn't really believe, at least until near the end, that humanity is worth saving. He views all the sins committed by the children of Cain. There's a really good scene where it shows their camp and it looks like hell. There's like massive cages full of people they're using as livestock. There's just rape and murder and all sorts of degeneracy. And he sees that, and he sees the way humans kill each other and destroyed the earth and stuff like that. And he doesn't really want to do it, not so much out of fear or anything, but because he doesn't think that humans are ultimately worth saving. Which is an attitude I think a lot of us can kind of sympathize with. I'm sure it's something that a lot of us have kind of struggled with. So the movie is largely about him trying to build the Ark, of course, and Cain's followers attempting to take the Ark. Now, because they're out of resources, they go to Methuselah, who gives him the last seed of Eden. I always kind of like these, I don't know what you want to call them, like extra canonical, like fantasy things with random stuff from the Bible. So stuff like the last seed of Eden, I think, is a really cool concept. So they use that to build the last forest, which gives them all the resources they need to construct the Ark. Emma Watson's character is initially infertile, but Methuselah performs a miracle and makes her fertile again. I think Cain's descendants turn on the Watchers and kill a bunch of them, and the remaining ones come to help Noah in hopes of getting a redemption. And later on, there's what I thought was the most beautiful scene in the movie. So, in terms of actual theology, my understanding is angels can't redeem themselves because of the way their wills work, because they're outside of time or something like that. But in the context of the movie, the Watchers earn their redemption, and they all die defending the Ark from the followers of Cain. And as they die, they regain their angelic forms and ascend back to heaven. One of them cries out that the Creator brings us home. There is some, like, evangelical who said it was the worst movie ever because they call God the Creator, which I don't really get why that's... I mean, he is the Creator. That's one of his titles. That seems like a pretty normal title to give him. There's another scene on board the Ark itself where Noah kills Cain's descendant, if I remember properly. And it shows this montage of he bashes his head in with something similar to Cain and Abel, and it just shows this montage of scenes throughout human history of humans doing something much like that. I think there's also some parts where Christ shows up, or at least the pre-incarnation form of him. But overall, I probably talked about this movie for too long, but it's just a really fascinating movie. I like how they took a very short story from the Bible and really kind of made it weird and surreal and added a lot of just kind of interesting aspects to it. So I definitely recommend giving Noah a watch. Just don't get too upset about the biblical accuracy of it. And I haven't watched this again because it's long and because it was really intense, and I'm not sure if I'd like it as much the second time. Next, we have Apocalypse Now, which I actually only sat down and watched the whole movie, I think last year or something like that. It took me a long time to get to this film, largely just because of how long it is. So I watched Apocalypse Now Redux, and that was 3.5 hours long, so that's the main reason I never got to it. I also kind of counter-signaled against this movie for a while just because of how popular it was, which was very immature and stupid. I'm not going to disagree with that, but when I finally watched it, I was very impressed by it. It has a lot of things that I like in movies or stories. Number one, and you'll see this a lot when we get into my top 10, my top 15 movies of all time, I really like Lost World stuff. Like where they come across kind of, I don't know if surreal's the right term, but just something that's completely separate from normal civilization. Stuff like Atlantis, The Lost Empire, or H. Rider Haggard stories or something, where they find like an alternate reality, or not really an alternate reality, but just a place where things are kind of weird. I like the kind of, I'm not sure if you'd call it an Odyssey-esque journey or something, but where the further along the character goes, the environment mirrors their mental state and the rules of reality start breaking down. That would be stuff like Stalker or Annihilation or Ad Astra is kind of a more science fiction version of Apocalypse Now. But I do like that. I like the whole Colonel Kurtz godhood thing. It's just a very fascinating, existentialist, weird stream of consciousness movie that just does a lot of things I really like in film very well. I haven't watched it again just because it's super long and because it hasn't been too long since I watched it last. Next, we have The Count of Monte Cristo, which is a film. I don't know how it took me so long to watch this movie, but this movie's awesome. I used to see trailers for this all the time back in when I was, I guess, 12 or 13 years old when this film first came out. And this is, I'd say, the definitive adaptation of the movie. And this movie is just so much fun. I mean, it has a lot of the stuff that I like in a movie. It takes place during the 19th century. And as you'll see later, I tend to like things that take place during the 19th century, during the Age of Discovery. This isn't quite the Victorian era yet, but just that kind of time period where there's a real sense of optimism and belief in human potential and human progress, that kind of thing. The acting is really good. The writing's really good. This is a film that realizes it's kind of a bit cheesy and kind of a bit campy and just goes with it. Plus, and I had read a abridged version of the original story, the fact that the main character becomes the wealthiest man on Earth and he uses his entire fortune to just troll people is just so hilarious and funny. It takes some liberties with the original story. Like, I think in the original story, if memory serves, the Count abandons his ex-GF and makes off with some QT Albanian woman. But in this one, he gets back together with his ex-GF again. But overall, it's just a really good movie. It's very karmatic, really good performances, very satisfying thematically. And I mean, Henry Cavill's in it. Who would have thought? I don't know why Henry Cavill's even in this movie, but he's welcome. And I mean, the Count is just such a badass between his money, his abilities as a troll. He was a pirate at one point, and his son's Henry Cavill. And the only thing more chat than being Henry Cavill is being the father of Henry Cavill. So it's just a film I had never really got into previously. After I've watched this movie a second time, it'll probably definitely edge something out into my top 15. But it's just overall great, great movie. Second last on the list, we have Nightcrawler. I'd say probably Jake Gyllenhaal's definitive performance. Nightcrawler is the story of. Just trying to think of how to even describe it. The main character, Lewis Bloom, is an independent photographer he's a psycho in a really kind of subtle way. And he kind of takes over this local news station and really changes it into being a lot more sensational. And he starts to try to like do illegal stuff to get news. And he starts to kind of create his own news. And it's just kind of a descent into a mad, mad world that he is creating. It's just really well shot. Jake Gyllenhaal does a really good job of being creepy and kind of towing the line between being sympathetic and being terrifying. It's, I think, one of the better instances of a villain protagonist done right. I just don't have enough good things to say about Nightcrawler. I just haven't watched it again because it was really intense and I've just never gotten around to it. And this brings us to the number one movie I haven't watched a second time, but I put among my favorite movies. And that movie is Paranormal Activity. Now, this might seem like a bit of a stretch nowadays, because this movie's been parodied to death. People make fun of this movie all the time. It's been endlessly ripped off and riffed on and stuff like that. But I remember I saw this in theaters back in 2007. And this movie was really, really big. It was kind of like the Blair Witch Project. I was a bit young at the time to remember the Blair Witch Project too much. I remember I watched the fake documentary on TV and I couldn't sleep for a week or two. But I never saw the Blair Witch Project in theaters. I did see this in theaters on opening night. And the hype around this was massive. I deliberately didn't read anything about this film going into it. And this is probably one of the best found footage films of all time. I mean, it's kind of an insult to compare later found footage films to this. There's like a couple I'd put up there. Like for me, Last Broadcast, OG Blair Witch Project, this movie, and maybe there's a couple others that have to go through and look at it, are good found footage, but most of them are just the worst mass-produced garbage possible. But this movie was completely and totally lived up to my expectations. It's just really well done. The camera work for a found footage film I thought was really good. They did a good job of keeping it from being too supernatural until the very end. For a great deal of the movie, it was kind of ambiguous. Is Katie doing the stuff? Is Katie not doing the stuff? Is it actually a demon? What is it? And it's very kind of ambiguous until the very end, just how powerful the demon is and how... I found the pacing very good, the acting good, considering it was a first movie for, I think, everybody involved in it. But the acting was very natural. It actually felt like a real found footage film, like some footage you could have actually found. The ending I found extremely scary and surprising. They just do a good job of balancing kind of jump scares and thrills with very subtle, kind of disturbing stuff and menace. I don't know if it's a film that you can ever really replicate. It's kind of a lightning in the bottle thing, where it came out at just the right time before found footage was the genre that it would eventually become. And I just haven't seen it again because I don't know if I can really relive what it was like to watch this movie for the first time. This was a really good one. If you haven't watched it, I'd recommend probably giving it a shot at some point. Just make sure to watch it in the dark, preferably on surround sound or something. Get a good like HD copy of the movie, and you should have a good time with it. But those are my top 11 favorite movies of all time that I've only seen once. Next up, we're going to do my top 15 movies of all time, period, period, period. So I hope you enjoy that, but God bless. Check out these films. I definitely like them. They may or may not be your thing, but they get the official Argent seal of quality.